The result of all this, ladies and gentlemen, is that this structure, this secret society, remains invisible to the average person. And it remains invisible not only because of its structure and because of its secrecy, but also because it has had the foresight of not having a name. Now just think about that for a minute. If you say that you have an organization or you create an organization and somebody says, well, what are we going to call ourselves? And the answer is, we're not going to call ourselves anything. We're not going to have a name. That way, nobody can talk about us. Brilliant. And that's what they decided to do. Quigley himself doesn't know how to describe it. At some places in his books, he calls it the network. In other places, he calls it the Rhodes Group. In other places, he just calls it the group. It has no name. And so therefore, that's another reason that it's invisible to the average person today. Now, at the inner circle of this organization that I'm describing, that was called the Society of the Elect. It originally consisted of Cecil Rhodes and a small brain trust of his very wealthy and influential political cronies from British politics and British banking. The center of gravity, as I said earlier, shortly thereafter, after Rhodes' death, didn't take long before the center of gravity shifted away to the Rockefeller Group, which was very quick to move into that circle. And now we see that there are centers or secondary centers of influence within the Rockefeller Group and centers within such organizations as the Bilderberg Group and the Trilateral Commission, to name just a few. And the goal shifted away from creating a world empire based in England to a world empire based in New York called the New World Order, but based on the model of collectivism. Now, the secondary rings around this society of the elect that Cecil Rhodes created were called roundtables. That's the name they gave them, roundtables. And these existed in the United States, Britain, and all of the former British dependencies. Finally, there was a tertiary group or ring around that was created. Each of those roundtables in each of the countries created another ring larger around it. And they called those, in most of the British dependencies, they called those the Royal Institute for International Affairs. You'll find that in England, you'll find it in Canada, and so forth. That's what it's called. It's still there. Very powerful, prominent institutions in British politics in all of these countries. In the United States, for some reason which I've never been able to find out, they didn't choose that name, I suppose because royal wouldn't be an acceptable word in the United States. So in the U.S., they call it the Council on Foreign Relations. And ladies and gentlemen, after 100 years of penetration into the power centers of society, the Rhodesian network, which I call it, I have given it a name, and I hope you'll pick it up and use it because we have to identify this group. I call it the Rhodesian network or the Rhodesians. After 100 years, the Rhodesians now are very close to the final achievement of their goal in the Western world. Now, I add the phrase in the Western world because we must not lose sight of the fact when we're looking at this group that there is another group out there which is just as dangerous, just as secret, just as cunning as the Rhodesians. And they, by the way, took a clue from the Rhodesians and they got rid of their name a few years ago. We used to call them communists. And then they got rid of their name. They pretended to go away. They pretended that they crumbled overnight. Great miracle. They're still there. I call them the Leninists. They have never renounced the theories or the goals of Lenin. They just renounced communism. Well, they never really had communism in any of those countries anyway. They always referred to themselves as socialists or Leninists or what have you. But all the old former communist commissars simply took their hat off when it said communist on the front of it, and they turned it around, and now it said social democrat. But you notice it's the same heads underneath the hats. The heads didn't change, nor did their real policies. But I want to emphasize that there is another very large and powerful and dangerous group out there, which I call the Leninists. And the Leninists and the Rhodesians are often seen warring against each other. Just take a look at Mr. Bush in Washington, D.C., and in Venezuela we've got Chavez. Now there's a perfect example of the Rhodesians versus the Leninists. And they fight each other. They are opposed to each other. They criticize each other. They hate each other. But the world that they want is the same. The only thing they disagree with is not ideology. It's who is going to run this new world order. Is it going to be the so-called left, or will it be the so-called right? And when you peel off all of those labels and you look underneath, you'll find that in all of these camps, what they really stand for is collectivism. That's the word we should be using. They're all collectivist in nature. But then they wrap themselves in flags and different rhetoric, and they appear to oppose each other. But I want to emphasize, just because we are focusing tonight on one group does not mean that that is the only place we need to keep our guard up, because we have another equally potential group very much alive in the world today. Now, that is my summary. It's time now to let the conspirators describe it, and so I'm going to do some reading for you. I guess I'm blowing into this. Is that what I'm doing? I hate to read a lot in a speech, but in this case, I feel that I have to, because otherwise you'd think that I was making some of this up. So I'm going to do a little extensive reading and let you see that the conspirators themselves really have said basically what I have said. Now, we'll begin, where am I? Okay. We'll begin in Tragedy and Hope by Carroll Quigley. And he says this. He says, I know of the operation of this network, because there he calls it a network, because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years during the 1960s to examine its papers and secret records. I have no aversion to it or to most of its aims, and have for much of my life been close to it and to many of the instruments. In general, my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown. Now, in the Anglo-American establishment, Quigley says this. The Rhodes Scholarship established by the terms of Cecil Rhodes' seventh will are known to everyone. What is not so widely known is that Rhodes, in 5 previous wills, left his fortune to form a secret society which was to devote itself to the preservation and expansion of the British Empire. And what does not seem to be known to anyone is that this secret society continues to exist to this day. To be sure, it is not a childish thing like the Ku Klux Klan, and it does not have any secret robes, secret handclasps, or secret passwords. It does not need any of these, since its members know each other intimately. It probably has no oaths of secrecy, nor any formal procedure of initiation. It does, however, exist and hold secret meetings. This group, as I shall show, is one of the most important historical facts of the 20th century. Now, one of the original leaders of this group, one of the organizers, was a fellow by the name of William Stead. Now, William Stead was so important that he was the executor of Cecil Rhodes' will. So he should know what he's talking about. And he wrote a book entitled The Last Will and Testament of C.J. Rhodes. And in that book, William Stead said this. Mr. Rhodes was more than the founder of a dynasty. He aspired to be the creator of one of those vast, semi-religious, quasi-political associations which, like the Society of Jesus, have played so large a part in the history of the world. To be more strictly accurate, he wished to found an order as the instrument of the will of the dynasty. So you see, they're looking at this like an order. It's not just a group or an organization. It's an order, like the Knights Templar or something like that. It's a chivalric order. In Cecil Rhodes' handwritten manuscript, this was not published until fairly recently, we find this coming directly from Cecil Rhodes' own pen. He said, "I contend that we English are the finest race in the world, and that..." I don't know what to do about this. Stop breathing, I guess. He says, "I contend that we English are the finest race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. What scheme could we think of to forward this object? I look into history, and I read the story of the Jesuits. I see what they were able to do in a bad cause, and I might say, under bad leaders. In the present day, I became a member of the Masonic order. I see the wealth and power they possess, the influence they hold, and I think over their ceremonies, and I wonder that a large body of men can devote themselves to what at times appear to be the most ridiculous and absurd rites, without an object and without an end. The idea, gleaming and dancing before one's eyes, like a will-o'-the-wisp, at last frames itself into a plan. Why should we not form a secret society, but with one object, the furtherance of the British Empire and the bringing of the whole uncivilized world under British rule?" So there you have it from the mind of the founder. Back to Quigley. In his own words, he says that the goal of the secret society was, quote, "nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences." Now, you see the trilateral meetings and the Bilderberg meetings begin to take on more significance when you realize that that's really part of this plan. On page 4 of the Anglo-American Establishment, Quigley says this: "This organization has been able to conceal its existence quite successfully, and many of its most influential members, satisfied to possess the reality rather than the appearance of power, are unknown even to close students of British history, partly because of the deliberate policy of secrecy which this group has adopted." You see there he calls it a group, which this group has adopted, partly because the group itself is not closely integrated, but rather appears as a series of overlapping circles or rings, partly concealed by being hidden behind formally organized groups of no obvious political significance, end quote. And then regarding the conspiratorial structure of this group, Quigley tells us this, quote, "In the secret society, Rhodes was to be leader. Stead, Brett, Lord Esher, and Milner were to form an executive committee called the Society of the Elect. Arthur, Lord Balfour, Sir Harry Johnston, Lord Rothschild, Albert Lord Grey, and others were listed as potential members of a circle of initiates, while there was to be an outer circle known as the Association of Helpers." Those phrases, ladies and gentlemen, that I just read are lifted from Adam Weishaupt. Those are his phrases. Association of Helpers. This was later organized by Milner as the Round Table organizations that I mentioned a moment ago. After the death of Cecil Rhodes, the organization fell under the control of Lord Alfred Milner, who recruited young men from the upper class of society to become part of the Association of Helpers, which, as I mentioned, became later known as the Round Tables.